United States is a nation that earns a proud place on the world stage. Teeming with activity are its bustling cities, its busy highways, proud military, and magnificent landmarks. And yet, a subtle and silent enemy threatens it all. For every gleaming bridge, there's another near collapse. Buildings decay, pipelines explode, roadbeds crumble. The enemy is rust. This, along with other forms of corrosion, attacks everything in our infrastructure. It's a destructive force that costs us about $500 billion a year. And with that much at stake, a new initiative is underway with Washington, D.C. as general headquarters of an all-out war on corrosion. It starts here at the U.S. Capitol, where even the iconic dome with its 9 million pound iron framework is vulnerable to rust. Now, to keep things from going too far, there is almost always some work going on to repaint the frame, seal cracks, or scrape away any corrosion that has managed to settle in. Corrosion, you see, whether on iron or any other material, is something that never stops. We can fix it when it happens, and we can try to prevent it, but all we can ever really do is slow it down. That's why we call it the Pervasive Menace. But as it happens, the members of Congress who work in this building have taken notice of the pervasive menace in a big way. They've realized that corrosion is a critical threat to the infrastructure of the entire country. So, to fight back, they've given this job to the same planners that are responsible for the safeguarding of the national security of the United States, the Department of Defense. I'm LeVar Burton. Join me now as we meet some of the people who have come up with an innovative and successful plan to fight this insidious peril. Watch as they lay out the battle strategy to fight corrosion as no one has ever fought it before. Rust is the most common form of corrosion, and wherever there's iron or steel, sooner or later, we get rust. The engineers who study corrosion call it the pervasive menace.
Corrosion is referred to as the pervasive menace because it affects everything, everywhere. It's like a cancer for all of our weapon systems and facilities and infrastructure.
We call corrosion pervasive menace because that's what it is. Absolutely positively, it surrounds us. It destroys everything.
Steels become rust. That means that lots of the metallic materials become oxides, so they crumble. And it's pervasive because it's continual, and it's always moving in the same direction, constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They are deteriorating, they're corroding, they're degrading.
Congress chose the Department of Defense to lead our war on corrosion, at least in part because the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps have so much that's vulnerable to corrosion. We're talking about every ship, plane, or tank, every piece of equipment, every building, every facility. Taking up the Congressional challenge, the Department of Defense has put together an innovative and aggressive program to fight corrosion across the board. What's more, the models and techniques can be adapted and transferred to any other government agency or private sector organization. Let's face it, rust happens everywhere, and it affects everyone. Most of us don't even pay attention to it until something goes wrong, and when it does go wrong, the consequences can be disastrous. Here's what happens when corrosion results in a worst-case scenario. In 1967, the Silver Bridge across the Ohio River between Ohio and West Virginia collapsed. 46 people were killed. A single corrosion-induced crack, only 1/10 of an inch deep, was the cause. The Defense Department may be leading the fight against corrosion, but the crusade extends to the entire country.
The nation's infrastructure is equally affected by corrosion as we are in the DoD. You can see it on bridges and overpasses and water main breaks and utilities. Everything that is exposed to the weather is in some way or form affected by corrosion.
Modern history is littered with corrosion-related disasters. 12 dead in 2000 after a corroded gas pipeline exploded near Carlsbad, New Mexico. 54 killed in 1992 when an El Al airliner crashed after 2 engines were torn off in flight. Corrosion, cracking, and fatigue failure in a fuse pin were blamed. 13 fatalities in 2007's famous I-35 bridge collapse in Minnesota.
This was a classic case of where corrosion was involved. Corrosion might not have even been considered causal, but it was a contributing factor in what happened to the bridge.
The I-35 bridge disaster brought the nation's crumbling infrastructure into the headlines.
I don't think anybody has to go very far before they can see corrosion in the nation's infrastructure, in bridges and buildings, even in their own cars sometimes. The roads get broken up by the corrosion, salt on roads, salt on all kinds of structures that we have. It's pretty bad. The corrosion is pretty bad in our infrastructure.
According to the Department of Transportation, nearly 162,000 of the nation's bridges are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. That's more than 1 in 4. Dealing with the consequences and avoiding deadly disasters is an ongoing and expensive burden. Take, for instance, the historic Bridge of Lions, built in 1927 in St. Augustine, Florida. It was named for its unique Carrara marble lions and noted for its distinctive and graceful steel arches. But the bridge's grandeur had faded and it was listed as one of the DOT's problem bridges in 1999. Corrosion from saltwater and heavy usage had deteriorated the bridge.
In 1982, this bridge was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, so at that time it was decided to rehabilitate rather than reconstruct. The bridge line was structurally deficient, and in 2004, $82 million 5-year construction project in Tampa, Florida.
After sandblasting, each massive arch was sprayed with a molten zinc compound in a process called metallizing to produce an extremely durable rust prevention layer.
Normally, painted bridges have to be recoated every 15 to 20 years, but because of the zinc spray, this bridge won't have to be recoated until 30 to 40 years from now.
That $82 million for the St. Augustine project is a drop in the bucket. The annual cost of corrosion to the United States amounts to 3.1% of our gross domestic product. In the year 2011, that came to something like $480 billion a year. That's more than $1,500 for every man, woman, and child in the country. Over $6,000 for a family of 4. Ouch.
We've known corrosion has been a big problem for decades, for a number of years in the whole industrial society and so forth. But only recently have we really been able to calculate and look at corrosion costs in sound economic practices to guide our strategies and directions.
Joe Payer, a corrosion engineer at Ohio's University of Akron, is the right man to talk about the cost of corrosion. In 2002, he and a team of colleagues did some serious number crunching and wrote an official report, Corrosion Costs and Preventative Strategies in the United States.
So the 2002 report that was undertaken under the guidance of the Federal Highway Administration, NACE International, and CC Technologies carried it out, was undertaken because Congress came to the Department of Transportation and asked, how much does corrosion cost and what can we do about it? And what they were looking for was trying to put corrosion in perspective with education, medical, transportation. Just how big is it, and what are some thoughts about what we might do about it?
One specific section in the corrosion report focused on the U.S. military. Its corrosion bill each year was enormous.
As you can imagine, I'm pretty close to the weapon systems that we field that keeps our country free. And approximately 25% of all the maintenance that we perform on our systems is due to corrosion. And that's quite a bit of money, like $23 billion a year.
In my opinion, Congress in 2002 looked at the situation within the Department of Defense and recognized a tremendous opportunity to do things better.
It turned out that the year 2002 was a turnaround year for what you might call corrosion consciousness on Capitol Hill. The Corrosion Cost Report was one of several factors that spurred lawmakers to action. And here's what Congress did. It added a section to the United States Code, our main body of general and permanent laws. Title 10 of the Code deals with the armed forces, and the new section, number 2228, starts with this simple phrase: there is an Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight.
When Congress created the Corrosion Office in the Department of Defense by changing Title 10 and creating Section 2228 in the United States Code, it enabled the department to put together a process of weaving corrosion into the acquisition management of both infrastructure and equipment. This allowed an atmosphere of cultural change.
And culture change would be no small job. The Corrosion Program would be designed to take what was called an overarching and integrated approach to a problem that everyone was used to dealing with on their own. From now on, things would be different. Here's where it all begins, somewhere far away from where most of us live, a place where they dig iron out of the ground so we can turn it into buildings, bridges, barracks, or battleships. But the thing is, you almost never find pure iron in nature. When we first dig it up, it looks like this, a lump of iron ore. But inside this rock, among the grains of other minerals, are flecks of iron in the form of iron oxide. That's a compound of iron known to most of us as rust. To make the support beams for a bridge or the hull of a warship, we have to fire up the blast furnaces to 1200 degrees to turn it into steel. Almost none of the materials we use to build things come straight from nature unaltered.
Basically, all materials that we use are some sort of refined materials. If we take iron, we would pull ore out of the ground, we would refine it to a pristine state. We make that into an object, and then it wants to go back to that natural state. The natural state is an iron oxide. In other words, it's been oxidized.
Nature will do everything it can to reclaim the materials we use to build things. Steel turns into rust, as in iron ore. Aluminum to the oxide, as in bauxite, aluminum ore. Corrosion, in the broad sense, even includes things like wood, which decays eventually into dirt. So you can see why the battle to combat corrosion is a never-ending war. Congress joined the battle in 2002 by creating the Defense Department Corrosion Office. But that was only a first step.
In June 2003, the General Accounting Office, that later became the Government Accountability Office, published a report on corrosion as regards to the Department of Defense.
The report was 52 pages long and filled with examples of corrosion damage to military equipment and facilities across the board. Its key conclusion was this: DoD and the military services do not have an effective approach to prevent and mitigate corrosion, or a strategic plan for corrosion protection. Corrosion management in the military services was in a state of disorder.
In the past, the DoD has essentially attacked corrosion on a system-by-system or a service-by-service basis.
There was no interaction between the military departments with OSD, Office Secretary of Defense, or even within the military departments themselves. So the facility folks did their thing, the equipment folks did their things. A lot of them doing a lot of really, really good corrosion prevention, but there was no integration, there was no interaction, and people in the same military department did not know each other.
And it was pretty amazing in the evolution of the Department of Defense Corrosion Program, the number of places that people were doing almost atrocious and costly things with no knowledge at all that they were doing these things.
As the GAO spelled out, corrosion not only cost us a bundle, it increased downtime, reduced readiness, and created safety hazards. Corrosion engineers had very little influence, and the services were missing important opportunities to save billions of dollars. What the Department of Defense did was create a culture change.
If you think about the Department of Defense, they have weapon systems that are to be deterrents, number one. So once that weapon system is obsolete, you throw it away. Okay, so the thought that we're going to preserve weapon systems was almost a foreign culture. So to change a culture that says we can preserve an asset and have it usable far longer was really a different culture.
The first corrosion executive named in 2003 was Michael Wynn, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics.
The corrosion problem was, I think, relatively well understood at the element leader, but not well understood anywhere close when it came to the total acquisition schema, or even in the maintenance arms of the services and in the logistics area of the Office of Secretary of Defense. I think bringing this cohesion and bringing leadership to it and essentially motivating the individual service sectors would lead, and did lead, to tremendous breakthroughs in application, and it also led to some synergies across the services that I think was available, but they did not realize it because they were working at such a low level.
Wynn made it clear the fragmented defense community needed to work together instead of separately to fight corrosion. But what was really different was this idea.
In approaching the corrosion control effort, it really required first a baseline knowledge of where corrosion's effects were, what is the top 10 list, what's the cost of corrosion. It really required taking a look deeper into the process. I just suffered the effects of having a 5-ton truck acquisition essentially sidelined as a result of the corrosive effects in seals and brakes and the bodywork. And I recalled as a lifeguard on the beaches of Florida that, you know, the corrosive effects of the sea happen, and most of our bases turned out to be close to the ocean. So the first thing I needed to do was to first motivate the people that there was going to be a change in the approach, because people is where it's at, and if you can get people motivated that they are now going to be problem solvers and not just problem repeaters, it makes a tremendous difference.
By considering corrosion up front and putting it early on in the process, you can absolutely positively improve the life of those products.
Billions of defense dollars a year were at stake when the Corrosion Office started work. Some figured 30% of that money could be saved by simply doing things they already knew how to do. Add advanced technology to the mix, and the savings could mount not only for the armed forces, but for the entire country as well. All they needed now was a plan. Since 2003, with a mandate directly from Washington, the government has been gearing up an official program to fight corrosion. And as with any government program, its genesis entailed an alphabet soup of acronyms for every entity involved in the process. Here's how it went. In T&C, the DOT told us that corrosion was costing billions, so the USHOR and the USS passed a section of the USC which gave a mandate to the DOD to set up the Office of CPO. It turns out that the Office of CPO is charged with CPC, which is too important to leave as an acronym alone. Corrosion prevention and control is what it was all about. Now, Congress gave the orders to the DOD, but what were their plans to carry them out?
In 2003, the Honorable Michael Wynn, who was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Acquisition Technology and Logistics, has convened a meeting inviting all service representatives who were the corrosion experts to talk about and discuss and address Congress's concern about corrosion prevention and control for the Department of Defense.
The result of that meeting was a document signed by more than a dozen key people. It was a charter formally creating a new entity with a new acronym. It was the CPC-IPT, the Corrosion Prevention and Control Integrated Product Team. Its aim was to create an overarching approach to the corrosion battle.
The Department of Defense Corrosion Prevention Control Integrated Product Team is the tool that brings the whole corrosion community across the Department of Defense together.
When you say overarching and integrating, what you did was set a framework to break down the barriers, the walls, the stovepipes, and change cultures all the way across wide areas, and in not just a single area, but across comprehensive areas such as training, such as technology, and the implementation of various things that had never been done before.
The products delivered by the integrated product team would be the specific strategies put into place to prevent and control corrosion. The CPC IPT is divided into 7 working integrated product teams, or WIPITs. Now, it may sound corny, but that's the perfect acronym for this job because WIPIT is exactly what these people are trying to do to corrosion. The assignment for each WIPIT is spelled out in the DoD's strategic plan, a detailed summation with a simple mantra that covers them all. Prevent, detect, predict, and manage. Now, I'll touch on all 7 of the WIPITs, but the one I'm most involved with is the Communication and Outreach WIPIT. This film and the others in the series are a part of our assignment to disseminate essential information about the menace of corrosion. As you can see, there are lots of people involved in our production. This WIPIT also uses the internet as a conduit for information. CorDefense.org and CorConnect.org are up and running as complementary websites offering online collaboration among corrosion engineers, as well as online training, simulations, and even interactive games. While the communications and outreach team gets the information out there, the Metrics, Impact, and Sustainment WIPIT concentrates on the quality of that information. And in large part, it centers on numbers.
I wanted to understand the cost of corrosion. If we can establish the cost of corrosion on a specific product, and we can balance the cost of preventing or avoiding that, and that, to me, would be ideal.
Metrics are all about measurement, and this WIPIT is neck deep into figuring out in exquisite detail what the cost of corrosion is for practically every piece of military equipment, under practically every conceivable set of conditions.
We typically determine these corrosion rates for facilities, military bases, even civilian infrastructure around the world by putting out corrosion coupons or other methods that will measure how severe the environment actually is.
One of the most corrosive environments is found at Cape Canaveral, where cooperation between the Corrosion Office and a civilian agency like NASA is demonstrably important. Luz Marina Calle is a NASA corrosion specialist.
There are many benefits of a collaboration between a civilian agency like NASA and the Department of Defense to fight corrosion, because we all have similar problems and we also have assets that are very important to our nation that need to be protected. So the collaboration avoids duplication of effort and allows us to share information that will be beneficial to all of us.
Perhaps the most impressive structure at the Cape is the gigantic Vehicle Assembly Building. At 526 feet, it's the largest single-story building on the planet. It was built in 1966 for assembling the massive Saturn V moon rockets, and in 2011, plans were begun for a complete overhaul. The extreme conditions, so close to the saltwater of the Atlantic Ocean, make corrosion a critical concern everywhere at the Kennedy Space Center. The Corrosion Program gets important data from NASA at its long-term exposure test site on the Cape, where materials are exposed to real-world local conditions to measure their susceptibility to corrosion. The results they get here add an important dimension to the research done inside the laboratory.
There's a very large amount of research that has been undertaken during the last decade. Much of this work is ongoing for the purpose of determining how severe environments are around the world. This is being done by the coupon monitoring method. There are also some other methods being used involving corrosion sensors, but it is all directed towards getting better numbers on how severe environments are and what we may be able to do with those metrics.
It all comes down to numbers. How much do different environments corrode different materials? How much does that affect the lifetime of an airplane, a tank, a ship, in the Space Center, or on the battlefield? It's a matter of readiness. In a nation of more than 300 million people, the government has a lot of physical things it needs to buy. And if anyone in private industry wants to make something for the government, military or civilian, they're going to run into specifications. Take this filing cabinet, a government filing cabinet. The federal specs say that the drawers can't be less than 10 inches high, the lock button can't stick out more than 5.6 millimeters, and the color should be either black, gray, or parchment. Parchment is one of my favorite colors. When it comes to corrosion and military equipment, the specs can be a complex headache. That's where the specifications, standards, and qualifications process whippet comes in, better known as SSQP. Its first job was to create order from a kind of chaos.
When we came up, our initial list was over 16,000, which was a daunting number. We then took those and tried to narrow it down to just those specifications that had to do with corrosion prevention control products or technologies. And that narrowed it down significantly. We end up with a little over 860 specs that had were just related to corrosion prevention control technologies.
While discussing the product introduction homepage, we gave you a brief taste of the specifications and standards search tool. Once again, this tool can be accessed by selecting the specs and standards search tool link.
Putting the streamlined standards into practice, the SSQP team has a tutorial online to walk private sector suppliers through the process. You find it under Product Introduction at the CorDefense.org website. The Policy and Requirements whippet has a similar role within the Defense Department itself. This team takes the broad view on corrosion fighting strategies. Before the corrosion program started, each of the different services had its own rules for dealing with corrosion. And that usually meant wait till it corrodes and then repair it. That old culture of corrosion fighting is preserved in a sense at the restoration shop of the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. At any given time, there might be a dozen different aircraft getting the makeover treatment. Here's the Memphis Belle. The iconic B-17 and its crew survived 25 combat missions in World War II, but corrosion has taken its toll in the decades since then.
The process of restoring the Memphis Belle in regards to corrosion involved us removing all the existing coatings from the aircraft so we could see what condition the structure was in, so we knew what areas to address. And during that process, there was a considerable amount of corrosion that was discovered due to water being trapped in the airframe sitting outside for a period of time, and the fact that it wasn't designed to last as long as it has.
In repairing corrosion on the Memphis Belle, original materials had to be used as much as possible for historical accuracy. The same goes for the C-82 project or the A-1H project or any of the projects underway here.
What we're looking at in this wheel well is where we've actually recoated the structure with, it's actually a water-based primer that we're using today, where back whenever this aircraft was built, it was a zinc chromate, which is a lot more hazardous than what the water-based products are. But this seals the metal and protects it from future corrosion.
Today, prevention gets a much higher priority than it had in the past. So the Policy and Requirements whippet aims not only at maintenance, but more importantly, at design. So they offer corrosion prevention guidance to program managers.
The Corrosion Prevention and Control Guidebook was an attempt to actually set some structure to design guidance for corrosion.
And that design guidance is aimed at the acquisition workforce, the defense employees responsible for buying military hardware of all kinds. For any project or program, the CPAT, acronym for Corrosion Prevention Action Team, is responsible for giving corrosion prevention guidance to program acquisition teams, assuring that corrosion is on the table from the very beginning.
The goal is to improve how we do business by addressing corrosion concerns early on in the programs, whether or not that's equipment or infrastructure.
While that may seem obvious for weapons, vehicles, and field equipment, they aren't the whole story. A separate working integrated product team was set up as the Facilities whippet. That includes all facilities and infrastructure. Here's an example: the Red Hill fuel storage tanks in Hawaii. These amazing things were completed in 1943 to protect military fuel supplies for the war effort. 20 250-foot high tanks buried underground to hold 6 million barrels of oil. the complex remains very much in use today. Under the Corrosion Program in 2005, the pipeline was pigged, a process that sends sensors down the pipe interiors to check for problems.
What we did was we inspected this pipeline with a new technology and found a lot of corrosion that would have been a big impact on Hawaii. Any fuel leak would have severely polluted the environment, the water table, and we just found a leak just by chance and prevented a disaster from happening.
While much of corrosion management involves doing what we already know how to do, we're always trying to push the envelope and invent ways to do things even better. That's why the science and technology team is an important part of the Corrosion Program and one of the most exciting. When Congress mandated the Defense Department Corrosion Program in 2002, it actually had more than just the Defense Department in mind. Corrosion was costing the military $20 billion a year in direct costs, but fighting that problem was only the first step.
The Department of Defense is a microcosm of the nation and indeed the world. Congress also recognized that if the Department of Defense could do something, they could then apply it on a broader scale to the nation. The opportunities to save massive amounts of money in both households, on the national infrastructure, everything that we see around us, the opportunities are tremendous.
One of the most important components of the team's strategy is the Technical Corrosion Collaboration. The TCC, as it's known, is a coordinated collaboration of universities, the military academies, and government labs working intensely together in drawing on each other's strengths. Professor James Rawlins leads a research group at University of Southern Mississippi. Their specialty is coatings, one of the most important in corrosion science. Most of the time, coatings basically means paint, but Rawlins and his colleagues are developing the coatings of the future.
The future of coatings, where we're headed with the technologies that are being developed all over the world in many labs, not just the corrosion collaboration, is that we're designing materials that would have the ability to adapt to the environment or respond to the environment. Terms that you'll hear are self-repair. We commonly use the term functional films. Those are materials that they have an inherent function within them. They can do their own synthesis, they can do the healing of scratches, not only function as we would have in the past to be protective and decorative, but also provide a function such that enzymes or microbes are embedded in the system or a chemistry is embedded in the material so that it could heal.
Among the other amazing technologies they're exploring at Rawlins' lab is adding a detection element to coatings. Ordinarily, paints are used to prevent something from corroding, but at some point, corrosion will take over and detecting it is a major difficulty. At University of Southern Mississippi, they add minute amounts of fluorescent materials into their coatings, in effect, making the paint its own corrosion sensor. They immerse the painted object in salt water and later run it through an ultraviolet fluorescent scanner, and the readout tells the corrosion story.
What we get from that is pictures of where the salt has already gone into the coating, where the water has gone into the coating, and we're measuring the rate at which that ingress occurs, which is related to the corrosion process and corrosion initiation.
The work of the Science and Technology Whippet is aimed at finding newer, better, and less expensive ways to cover the core concepts of the Corrosion Program: prevent, detect, predict, and manage. Science and technology in themselves are very important to the war on corrosion, but a war also needs experts in material degradation and material selection. That's where the Corrosion Program has its sights set, on the next generation. The next generation. I like the sound of that. Corrosion TNG, the men and women who will fight this good fight for years to come. The Defense Department's Corrosion Program is really all about the future. We're talking about the future of our military equipment, how long it'll last, how ready it will remain, and how we can keep corrosion from eating away at the bottom line of both cost and effectiveness. That concept comes into focus with the last of the working integrated product teams we're looking at today. We're talking about the Training and Certification Whippet, aimed at making sure there are always people truly qualified to carry on the war against corrosion.
There's a notion that we can save a tremendous amount, up to 30%, by just doing things that we know how to do. One of the underlying reasons why it doesn't get done that way is that there are constantly inexperienced people who don't have these stripes, who design things without consideration, without that experience, without the training in the corrosion areas, and hence they end up designing things in place that end up corroding much more rapidly than they would have if someone with experience had done it to begin with.
Getting that experience starts with education. For workers already engaged in the fight against corrosion, the Training and Certification Whippet has developed detailed online courses posted on the Core Connect website.
Quantitative tests are used to characterize the effects of given failure modes on component performance and to determine a system's time to failure.
The courses are targeted at a wide audience, from the general public just needing the basics to defense acquisition workers who need details for their purchasing decisions, to specialists developing detailed anti-corrosion strategies. Perhaps the most innovative contribution of the training and certification team is the University of Akron's Bachelor of Science in Corrosion Engineering, begun in 2009 and the first of its kind in the country.
The corrosion engineering program here, one of a kind currently in the U.S., really serves a very important marketplace. There's a tremendous need for trained corrosion subject matter experts to go out and fight the costs of corrosion at every level. And our program is designed and geared to do that.
The University of Akron is a public research university in northern Ohio. It has a long history of collaboration with industry, and its location in the middle of the Rust Belt made it ideal for the new program.
Corrosion is such a major problem for Ohio and for the nation that when the Department of Defense, together with representatives of industry, asked us if we would consider starting the first ever baccalaureate program in corrosion engineering, it seemed like a natural. It was something that we simply said yes.
With just a few dozen students at the outset, the corrosion engineering program was an opportunity to grab for students eager to make a difference.
As a kid growing up in Northeast Ohio, I think we're all sort of cognizant of the rust factor, that our cars rust. You know, if you leave a rake outside in the rain, it's going to rust. And as a kid, I used to help my dad sandblast our cars and repair the rust. So I could definitely see myself one day working to fix rust, but I never thought it would be professionally. And that just sparked my interest. You know, it hit home that I could actually go into this field and I could really solve problems. So that was very exciting.
The students work side by side with researchers exploring the cutting edges of corrosion science. In addition, they get the chance to connect with industry reps at conferences and professional meetings.
When I went up to the booths and talked to different companies or people from industry, they were really excited to see young students already getting training in corrosion. Almost everybody I had talked to that was a corrosion expert, they had received their training after graduation.
I believe that having a degree in corrosion engineering will give me an edge because I'm coming out with knowledge that not many people in this nation or even in the world will have.
Private sector companies desiring those skills eagerly joined the Defense Department Corrosion Office to support the university's program.
Last Friday we were at a meeting where I saw 55 students that are studying to be corrosion engineers. It's a dream come true. And the whole thing that these students are going to come out with is an understanding that that happens, that there are means to prevent it, but probably moreover, that there is a lot of money that's saved that would otherwise be wasted by allowing these structures to deteriorate. It's a drain on our economy and will actually, when they apply what they're doing, make us in the United States more competitive in the world economy.
The students at University of Akron will become corrosion warriors in the years to come. They'll join the dedicated people who have made so much progress since the DoD program started in January of 2003. Taking a unified, overarching, and integrated approach means we're making more headway against the pervasive menace than ever before. We're always learning how to do it better and more economically. But fighting corrosion is a job that's never really finished because, as we've said before, rust never sleeps.